Mountain Lake PBS brings you this Election 2020 special, the New York State Senate 45th District debate. Now, tonight's moderator from Mountain Lake PBS, Tom Halleck.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our debate with the two candidates running for the 45th District seat in the New York State Senate. The 45th is the largest Senate district in the state, covering the cities of Plattsburgh and Glens Falls, and all are part of 6 counties across northeastern New York, the eastern Adirondacks, and the North Country. It is a seat that has long been held by Senator Betty Little, who has announced she is retiring at the end of the year after 17 years serving in the Senate and 25 years in the New York State Legislature. And tonight, we welcome the two candidates hoping to fill that seat. Republican Dan Stec from Queensbury, who is the State Assemblyman for the 114th District, and Democrat Kimberly Davis from Plattsburgh, who is the Clinton County Treasurer. We have two journalists who will be asking the candidates questions. LoTemplio is the editor-in-chief with the Plattsburgh Press Republican, and Aaron Cerbone with the Adirondack Daily Enterprise. The setup here in our studio has changed because of the COVID pandemic. We are using social distancing with everyone at least 10 feet apart, and anyone who isn't talking is wearing a mask. Random draws have determined the order of opening and closing statements and who gets the first question. The candidates will have 90 seconds, a minute 30 to respond to questions, 30 seconds for rebuttals. We begin with opening statements. Mr. Stec.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Stec, and I'm currently an Assemblyman for the 114th Assembly District, but I'm running for Senator Little's open Senate seat. It's been a privilege to work in the Assembly side by side with Betty Little for the last 8 years. A little bit about myself. I was born and raised here in the district in the Glens Falls area. My mother was a secretary at the Queensbury High School. My father used to be a Marine, and then he was a forest ranger for his career. So service is part of my family's background. It was instilled in me in a young age how important that was. After I graduated from college, I served in the United States Navy as a nuclear engineer for 8 years. When I got out of the Navy, I could have lived anywhere in the country that I wanted to. I chose to come back to my home because I love it here, and I chose to continue to serve. I started in the private sector, but I also was on the Zoning Board of Appeals, and then I was a town councilman, and I tell everyone I realized at that point that I liked my part-time work more than my full-time work. So I served as the Queensbury Town Supervisor for 9 years. Those last 2 years, I was the chairman of the Warren County Board of Supervisors. And then the Assembly seat became open, and I ran for that, where I've served in the last 8 years in that capacity, again, side by side with my friend and mentor, Betty Little. And it's been a privilege to serve in the Assembly District and gather some knowledge about how state government works and what the issues are and what the advocacies that are competing against each other are sometimes. And I want to continue to work in that vein and expand on that knowledge and serve the rest of the North Country by filling Senator Little's shoes as she retires and hopefully enjoys a long retirement. Thank you.
Mr. Stec, thank you. Ms. Davis, your opening statement.
Thank you, Tom Halleck and Mountain Lake PBS, and for everyone tuning in, as well as our journalists tonight. I grew up in a small rural community. My parents provided a roof over our heads, lots of love, but they couldn't afford much else. They taught me the value of hard work, and through most of my teens and 20s, I held 2 jobs because they couldn't afford to send me to college. I worked in retail and in banking before I became a town assessor. When the opportunity came, I came and had earned my degree at SUNY Plattsburgh. That access to an affordable public education changed my life, and upon graduation, I decided of all the places in the world, this is where I wanted to build my life. I'm running to be your champion in the 45th District. I believe we need an advocate for all people who will work with anyone and everyone to rise to the biggest challenges that we are facing with real life solutions. I intend to be everyone's senator, whether they agree with me or not, and regardless of the letter next to their name. This year has highlighted the things that matter the most to us: our health, our families, and the ability to connect to the outside world. I will fight for education and infrastructure funding, for reliable and accessible health care. I've been the Clinton County Treasurer for the last 7 years, saving millions of dollars for our taxpayers. We need someone in Albany with a financial background, and I want to be that champion for you.
Ms. Davis, thank you very much for your opening statement. Our first question will come from LoTemplio, and Mr. Stec, it will come to you first. Joe?
Thanks, Tom. And thank you both for being here. It's good that the voters get a chance to hear from you directly in this election. I want to start by talking about this pandemic has been hard on the country, state, and localities financially, economically. New York's facing a big deficit, $14–15 billion. And unless there's another federal stimulus package and some aid, it's going to be a real tough budget scenario going forward. So what would your priorities be to protect in budget negotiations? And are there specific areas where you think spending could be cut to reduce the deficit and offset deeper cuts in state aid to schools and municipalities?
Sure, and that's a great question, Joe. Thank you for the opportunity. You know, certainly we had a $6 billion deficit before COVID, and now we're looking at $14 billion. And you're absolutely right. The governor and everyone is hoping that the federal government provides some sort of relief to us and every other state. So that's a long line, and the pot is limited. So we have some difficult choices that we need to make. A lot of us have been saying in Albany that these choices were facing us before COVID, but now there's no ignoring them. Certainly, there are some things that are absolutely off the table for me. Education, our disabled population, those are two right off the bat that I don't think we should be looking to cut at all. I also don't think that we should be raising taxes. We are already the most taxed state in the country, and we have the worst business climate. We're going to need our business to help bootstrap ourselves out of this situation by economic development. Now, specifically, we have a $170 billion state budget. By comparison, Florida, who has more people than we do, has a $90 billion budget. So certainly there's room for belt tightening. New York has a spending problem. It does not have a taxing problem. We have billions of dollars that we spend in Medicaid that is wasted in fraud, waste, and abuse. And that's been documented, and there's been studies that show it's in the billions of dollars a year. That's the first place to tighten down, but there's been a reluctance to do so in Albany to this point. But also $400 million tax credit for Hollywood, $100 million for public campaign finance, $100 million in checks going to deceased people for benefits. These are areas that should be cut immediately. They should have been cut long ago.
Thank you. Ms. Davis, same question, minute 30.
Thank you very much, Tom. There are two ways to fix this problem. One, of course, is raising taxes, and the other are cuts. We certainly need to make cuts for anything that is non-essential. This is going to be a very tough year, and hopefully some cuts will be very short term, but we certainly need to make cuts for anything that is not a non-essential service. This is a time, however, when more people are going to need services, social services, mental health and addiction services, offices for the aging. But one thing that is very clear is that people want to live in New York. Our millionaires and billionaires are where I'm looking to raise taxes, not on low and middle income families. Property tax owners do pay enough in taxes. But there is a scare tactic going on that New York will lose the millionaires and billionaires. That isn't true. There are 118 billionaires in New York City, and during this pandemic, that number actually increased to 1. What does that mean? The rich get richer? That is true. In this case, $77 billion on average for each one of those billionaires. All I'm asking is that they got rich by using community resources and infrastructure. Now is the time for them to help their fellow New Yorkers by paying a little bit more in tax.
All right, next question from Aaron Cerbone. And it goes to Ms. Davis first.
This sort of segues into my next question. Many Senate Democrats have supported the idea of higher state taxes on the very rich to address this budget crisis. One is aimed at ultra-millionaires, another that would tax billionaires at a higher rate. Would you support new taxes on the ultra-rich?
I think I did answer that question in my last. I would. I'm not going to take up everybody's time, but I will just say that, again, no one gets rich on their own. They use the resources that we all fund. And so again, I'm not saying necessarily this needs to be a long-term approach, but certainly in this time of our greatest need, these few people certainly can help their fellow New Yorkers by paying a little bit more.
Thank you. Mr. Stec, same question, minute 30.
Well, again, I think I covered it, but I think it's worth repeating. We are the highest tax state in the country. We have a spending problem, not a taxation problem. I'm opposed to raising taxes. The bottom line is that people are leaving the state. In the last 10 years, we've had about 1 million net outflow from New York State, and these are people that can leave. We have a very mobile economy right now, and it's very tempting to relocate your wealth and your business operations outside of the state, and so that will be a net downward spiral if we continue to chase people that are producing, our job creators, our farm owners. These are people of means. It doesn't take much to all of a sudden find out, wow, I didn't know I was wealthy. It's a very slippery slope to continue down that path that New York is done so well of continuing to raise taxes, raise taxes, and raise taxes to the point where we're the highest tax state in the country.
And rebuttal, Ms. Davis, 30 seconds.
Thank you. Again, I'm talking about the ultra wealthy, the people who can afford it. In 2010, New York had over 300,000 millionaires. In 2019, over 500,000 millionaires. These are the people I'm asking to step up to the plate in this time of crisis.
All right, next question from Joe LoTemplio.
Speaking of raising revenue, this idea has been talked about in the past a bit, although I haven't heard much of it in this cycle, so why not bring it up? Should the state consider legalizing recreational marijuana and as a means to generate more revenue?
Mr. Stec, we begin with you for a minute 30.
Sure. I'm opposed to legalizing recreational marijuana. I question the math and the experience of other states out there that have legalized it as to is it a tax windfall. It's also a burden on a lot of programs. There's a lot of problems that come with recreational drug use that are seen in these states that have legalized it. So you start wondering, well, the tax revenue, is that greater than or less than the social costs to the taxpayer in these programs? But more importantly, in talking in the 8 years that I've been in the Assembly on this issue, and it's come up many times, law enforcement is opposed to it. The drug counseling people are opposed to it. District attorneys are opposed to it. They see that it is a gateway drug and it'll lead to more trouble than solve problems. So for those reasons, I have been and will continue to oppose legalized recreational use of marijuana.
Thank you. Ms. Davis, minute 30.
I actually would vote to legalize marijuana. Marijuana has, especially in New York where we've had medical marijuana, it has been passed to help people with serious medical conditions. It also has been used for our veterans with PTSD. So I think that when you look at, even the National Institute on Drug Abuse has said that marijuana is no more a gateway drug than alcohol or nicotine. We need to look at this, we need to get this out of the shadows, and we also need to address an issue that most people don't want to talk about, but arrests for marijuana affects communities of color more than anyone else. There's a study done that in New York City, 1/4 of the white population used marijuana, but 92% of the people arrested are people of color. It's not right, and I am not for that.
All right, next question from Aaron Cerbone.
With the future of the Affordable Care Act potentially up in the air as it goes through the U.S. Supreme Court, there's a renewed focus on health care. Single-payer Medicare for all has been discussed and proposed in New York State since the early 90s. Where do you stand on the state adopting a single-payer system of health care? And if not, what can the state do to rein in health care costs while keeping New Yorkers covered?
Ms. Davis, we begin with you, a minute 30.
Absolutely. I believe that health care is a right. Unfortunately, I do think that this needs to be done on a federal level. When you look at the New York Health Act, our New York State Controller, Tom DiNapoli, is one of the most well-respected state officials, has said that this is not financially feasible. The only state that has tried single payer is Vermont, and it failed miserably after 3 years because of the cost. The other thing that people don't talk about with the New York Health Act is we would have to receive a waiver from the federal government because of Medicaid, and in this political climate, that's not going to happen. We do need to find and make sure that the federal government does do this, because health care should not be tied to your employment. 2.6 million New Yorkers lost their jobs during COVID, and they should not have to go into a bankruptcy because they don't have health insurance. We also need to make sure that our healthcare workers, our frontline essential workers, are getting the protection, the PPE that they need, and also hazard pay. These people did not sign up to risk their lives for COVID, and we need to make sure that we are keeping them safe. They're also putting their families at risk, so we need to make sure that we are doing everything we can. Rural healthcare also needs telemedicine. Rural doctors are hard to get, and we need to make sure that telemedicine can be used, but we can't do that without adequate broadband coverage.
Thank you. Mr. Stec, a minute 30.
Yeah, could you restate the question?
Yeah, with the Affordable Care Act going through the Supreme Court, there's sort of this renewed look at single-payer health care, and it's been discussed in New York State since the 90s. Would you support a single-payer system of health care, and if not, what can the state do to rein in health care costs while keeping New Yorkers covered?
Okay, we've looked at the single-payer health care in the legislature since I've been there the last 8 years. I've opposed moving to single-payer. Is simply unaffordable. I think the most recent estimate I recall was $200 billion. This would increase taxes, so it's not sustainable. Vermont started heading down this path, and they backed away because they quickly realized for small Vermont it wasn't affordable, let alone New York and as complex an issue it is here. So I'm opposed to single payer. So then the question is, well, what's the approach then if you're not going to embrace a single payer system? As I mentioned earlier, fraud, waste, and abuse is a huge issue in our Medicaid system, billions of dollars a year. And one solution that my conference has proposed in the past that has legs and certainly would go a long ways to rein in this wasteful spending would be biometric screening, identification of both the patient and provider to make sure that there's a link up for every service so that you don't have fictitious people being billed. The fraud and waste that's occurring isn't necessarily on just the receiving end, but it's also structurally in some of the providing end. And biometric identification for pairing up these services with patients would go a long ways to root that out. And then another thing, though, on a national level is providing allowing for interstate competition for medical insurance, so that more competition in the market is generally a good thing, and it would lower costs. And right now, that would be a change that would go a long ways towards lowering the cost of healthcare in New York State.
Thank you. Rebuttals? All right, Joe, next question comes from you.
Thanks. Switching to COVID-19. New York has gotten a lot of attention during this pandemic, especially at the beginning as it was the epicenter early on. The governor has gotten a lot of attention for the way he's handled this pandemic. Praised in many circles, criticized in others. One of the areas he was criticized for was for requiring nursing homes to accept COVID positive patients, and then refusing to release the number of COVID related deaths in nursing homes. Should the state health department release those numbers? And should there be, as many lawmakers are calling for, an independent investigation into those nursing home deaths?
Mr. Stec, we begin with you, a minute 30 on
The
this.
two questions I heard is, should the Department of Health release the numbers, and should there be an investigation? The answer to both of those questions briefly is yes. The public has a right to know, and public officials should be held accountable for their decisions. Now, I don't fault the governor for doing the best that he could at the time. People have compared what's going on to trying to build an airplane while you fly it. So there was a lot going on, especially early in the crisis, where mistakes were being made. It's human tendency not to want to admit that you've ever made a mistake. Some humans are a little more prone to this issue than others. I think our governor is one of them on the nursing home question. But by and large, though, the bottom line is we need to release these numbers so that we know exactly what happened. The public has the right to know them. And if that's not going to happen, then there absolutely should be an investigation to make sure that we're learning from our mistakes. Mistakes were made. There's 7,000 some odd people that have died in nursing homes. Either it's somebody's fault or it's not. But 7,000 deaths, I think, commands that we investigate and see what happens if for no other reason, to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes in the future.
Thank you. Ms. Davis.
The short answer as well is I agree. Absolutely, they should be released. An investigation should be done. There was no playbook for COVID, and certainly this is one area where we did not get the right answer. But there have been other areas where we've done very well. I'm glad to see that New York is not one of the hot spots, and I'm looking forward to continuing on this recovery.
Next question from Aaron Cerbone.
In March, the legislature granted the governor unlimited emergency powers as the coronavirus began its first initial sweep through the state. He used this to order the shutdown of schools and the shutdown and reopening of businesses, mandating social distancing and other safety protocols. Do you believe lawmakers should now consider rescinding these emergency powers, or does the governor still need the emergency powers to deal with the COVID crisis?
Ms. Davis, you first for a minute 30.
I do think that we are near the end of where the governor should have these powers. We have seen an increase in COVID cases in almost all of the counties in the 45th district. I am concerned about a second spike coming, but anything that the governor is doing should be as a last resort if using executive order powers at this point. But we need to make sure that we continue to get through this crisis. There certainly have been hotspots around the state that he has had to deal with in very recent weeks. And so I think we are at the end, and I think he is doing what he needs to do to keep us safe, but those powers do need to end soon.
Thank you, Mr. Stec.
Months ago, I and other members of my conference called for the termination of these emergency powers. I supported it when we voted on it. It was the right thing to do at the time, and I think if given the opportunity to do it again, I think we would. Knowing what we knew, we thought that this was going to be a very difficult, and it has been, but the fear was that it was going to be an even worse situation where you would need somebody in an executive nature to make minute-to-minute, hour-to-hour decisions. And early on, I think you can make the case for that. And so we changed the definition of what qualified as an emergency to include a pandemic or a disease outbreak. Believe it or not, that wasn't on the list, but volcanoes literally were on the list. So we did the right thing there. But now, months later, while we're still in an emergency, the urgent nature of the emergency is behind us, where we do not need an executive making minute-to-minute decisions, moving the goalposts, changing the rules in a way that's appearing arbitrary. The urgency portion of the nature of the emergency is over, and so I think that we should be rescinding that. We should be reinstituting the legislature as a co-equal branch of government. That's what our founding fathers intended for our government to run, is a system of checks and balances where the legislature was a check on the power of the executive. We need to get back to that because that's not the way that we were supposed to be operating our government.
Wondering, you both said that you would like the legislature to take back those powers. I'm wondering if you would want to continue some of the same mandates, the same powers of opening and shutting certain industries, masks, social distancing, things like that. Would you want to add, remove, or keep them the same?
Let's keep this to 30 if we could. Ms. Davis, you first.
That is why I don't think we need to shut this right now, shut off the powers that the governor has. We don't know that we are through an emergency yet. We, like I said, have seen bigger numbers in these last few weeks, and as people come inside, as schools opened, we know we're going to see this, whether it is at our colleges, our correctional facilities, or our nursing homes. The numbers are increasing again, so we need to make sure that we do get through this and then make the emergency powers end.
And Mr. Stec, 30 seconds.
Well, certainly I didn't say that we were out of the emergency. I said the urgent portion of the nature of this emergency is behind us, and I think that that's true, and I think that the numbers and the hospitalizations and the death rates have shown that. I thought the question was, is it time to terminate the governor's emergency powers? I think it is. It's not to say that the legislature couldn't step in and say, in these limited instances, you have this authority now, Governor, but to allow the governor to unilaterally change election law now is completely unnecessary, but yet he has the authority to do that, even as we stand here today. So I think it's time to end the emergency powers, and maybe we give him a limited scope in some areas, but we still have an emergency, but the urgent nature of it isn't quite what it was 6 months ago.
All right, Joe, with the next question.
Yes. In the pandemic, we saw last spring, schools were shut down. Remote learning took place at all levels. That was quite a challenge, obviously, for everybody. And also highlighted the need for solid rural broadband in this area, in the North Country. How are we finally going to answer the question how we're going to get rural broadband for everybody, and how do you pay for it?
Mr. Stec, let's begin with you, a minute 30.
Absolutely. This was a big issue before COVID hit, and I think COVID's done a wonderful job of highlighting its even greater need now, because everyone in the world is using it for work, for school, telemedicine. I mean, telemedicine wasn't really something that was being talked about at the dinner table a year ago, but it is now. So the demand is there, but the demand was always there. I had students that were going to the parking lot of the public library to gain Wi-Fi access to do their homework before COVID. And so now all the kids are trying to get their schoolwork done. We allocated, the legislature, and I supported this, $500 million that we gave to the executive. And the executive, the governor, had the authority to get that ball rolling, and he has, and we've made progress. Unfortunately, we haven't made nearly the kind of progress that we intended to, and there's a lot of reasons for that. This make-ready business where the pole owners siphoned off a lot of money that was intended to go for broadband. It's also important to realize that these are private companies that we're dealing with, so we're trying to incentivize them. We don't really have the authority at this point to mandate them to do a build-out. So you should have a public-private partnership that the executive is trying to organize $500 million, At the end of the day, $500 million is likely not going to be enough. There's also a lot of projects that have been approved and they just haven't been to construction yet for a variety of reasons. And right now, unfortunately, COVID is also tends to be the brunt of the blame of that slowdown. But as we build this out, I'm confident that my job is to help the governor fulfill his promise to get 100% broadband. And we're going to do that, and it's taken longer than any of us would like. But we're just going to keep slugging it out until we get it done.
Thank you. Ms. Davis.
Thank you. Unfortunately, not everyone even has that opportunity. I did also receive the same calls in my county office where parents were looking for that Wi-Fi signal, but not all communities have that opportunity. Even our EMS, I was at the Casa Una Fire Department where I could not get a signal at a firehouse. That is not acceptable. We were promised that by the end of 2018, 99.9% of New York State would be covered, and that has not happened.
Our next question from Aaron.
Backlash of criticism from judges, prosecutors, and police over the bail reform law passed in the legislature in 2019. It abolished bail for most nonviolent crimes without giving judges discretion to hold defendants they believe pose a threat. Lawmakers voted this year to roll back some of the changes. Did it fix the flaws, or does more need to be done? And please be specific about what provisions of the law you want to see altered, overhauled, or repealed, and why.
Ms. Davis, we begin with you, a minute 30.
Okay, I don't think a minute 30 is enough for that, but I'll try. So the original bail reform I would not have voted for. The second stab at it did fix some of the issues, but judges need more discretion. There are people who, if they are being arrested, and whether the timeline is more than once in a week, in a month, judges need that discretion. There's obviously an issue if people are getting arrested, and we've seen that, where people are getting arrested multiple times and they are being let out. Now, the intention of bail reform was good. It is that there should be one justice system, not depending on if you are rich and can afford the bail or poor. We are supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. But there certainly are things that need to be fixed. I was glad to see that more crimes were added. But there's just too much that needs to be fixed with this, and I will let Mr. Stec go.
Mr. Stec, a minute 30.
All right, I voted against this. First of all, it's important to remind people that bail reform and the bail reform in 2019 and the fixes that were done in 2020 were both done as part of the state's budget process. As I mentioned earlier, it's a $170 billion budget, and to most people that are going to watch this, when you say the word budget, they think of revenues and expenditures. They don't think about major policy changes in the way that the criminal justice system works. But so that's an error with the process of what we do, how we do business in Albany, that has been brought to us and is commonplace and seems to be accepted by everybody in Albany and frankly the media. But I voted against it. Unfortunately, it went far beyond somebody steals a loaf of bread to feed their family nonviolent crime. And what was listed were dozens and dozens of truly violent offenses. And the other big problems with it is that the law enforcement community and the criminal justice community in general, your district attorneys, and the court system were not consulted. They were never consulted in the drafting of the fixes or of the initial bail reform. Now, we've come a long way in fixing some of that, but we've added a lot of costs to our local police departments and our local counties that are going to have to do all the discovery part. That the discovery is also part of this. But the bottom line is that the judiciary still does not have the discretion that I think most voters want their judges to have. They trust them, they elect them. The county judges are elected by the public, and they want them to exercise that discretion. And that discretion, they've been handcuffed here, and that's a real shame. And that's why I want to repeal it.
Ms. Davis, would you like another 30 on it?
Actually, so Dan is talking about the budget process, which I agree that there's too much that is pushed through. That's why I think that it's really important that we ask the legislators to have the same calendar as Congress. There's no reason that they should be in session from January to June. There should be more time so that the budget can be dealt with as its own entity and then legislation throughout the rest of the year.
Mr. Stec, final thoughts?
There are many, many states that have a much, much, much shorter legislative calendar than New York State. I think that the longer that the legislature is in session, the more money that we spend and potentially the more damage we do, frankly, to our to our state. So I'm not sure that I'm on board with a longer session. We pass this message of necessity every April 1st because we're surprised that April 1st follows March 31st. That's not an emergency. But every year we pass a message of necessity to adopt a budget. So we're denying the public, the media, and the constituents the opportunity to read the budget bills. That's wrong. The way that we do the budget process, and frankly, if we had a longer session calendar, I don't think that would change in New York State. I think that the budget process, unfortunately, would continue to be broken.
Thank you. Ms. Davis?
So just because other states don't have a shorter, that's like saying to your kid, you're going to jump off the cliff because all of your friends do. I don't think that's a good answer. And you're saying that we're going to do more damage the longer we're in session. I also don't think that's a good answer. I think that our legislators are paid plenty and they should not get any more money for a longer calendar.
We'll move on to our next question with Joe LoTemplio.
Thanks, Tom. This summer, after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, there was a large call across the country for racial justice and protests and marches and a lot of action regarding that. The governor has ordered citizens oversight panels, committees, to work in local municipalities to review policing policies and procedures, to examine everything they do, their use of force, their tactics, and the whole spectrum of police policies. There have been calls across the country to defund the police and dedicate some of that funding to community agencies like drug addiction or mental health services. Would you support legislation that aims to redirect funding for police agencies?
Mr. Stec, we begin with you.
I am firmly opposed to defunding the police. While there might be needs for review, reflection, holding people accountable when they do wrong, when they break the law, just like news people and politicians and teachers and doctors, there are bad people in all these professions, and when they're discovered, they need to be dealt with accordingly. I mean, that's our criminal justice system. So they need to be held accountable. But the idea that we need to defund the police, as the Working Families Party has called for, is absolutely ludicrous. That's cutting off your nose to spite your face. The solution to that isn't to take funding away from the police. If anything else, more training might be needed, more resources might be needed to go out and make sure that we're doing the best job that we can. But people need to remember that law enforcement people, when they're hired, they go through background checks, they go through psychological screenings. I mean, they get a harder look than just about any profession does. And yet, unfortunately, there's still the occasional bad apple that gets through, and that person needs to be dealt with. And I fully support holding them accountable, but the idea that the entire profession is wrong and needs to be defunded is a public safety disaster waiting to happen. I'm firmly opposed to it. I back the blue.
Thank you. Ms. Davis.
Thank you. Policing is about community safety. Defunding the police is political rhetoric. What I believe is that we need to give our police departments the most resources that we can. This also includes mental health services. 1 out of 5 calls nationally to 911 centers are for mental health, addiction, and homelessness issues. In the period after 9/11, we became really good at the see something, say something. And so people call 911 when they know something is wrong. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's something violent going on or crime is being committed. What I'm saying is that mental health professionals could serve 2 purposes with our police departments: to be hired by the police department as a ride-along in a non-violent, non-criminal situation as prescribed by police dispatchers. My mother was a police dispatcher. I remember her coming home and calling, telling us about calls that were heartbreaking but had nothing to do with a crime. Also, our police see things that no person should ever see, the things that they witness. When they go back to the station, there isn't someone for them to talk to process what they have witnessed. So in my mind, it is increasing our funding, increasing resources to our police departments. A great example right here in Plattsburgh is the community center. We have opened that up so that they have coloring with a cop for children, so that their first instance with a police officer is a good one, or coffee with a cop, where a person can go in, have a cup of coffee, have a conversation. It's that communication with our communities is what we need.
Thank you. Mr. Stec, rebuttal?
Yeah, again, I just want to point out my opponent saw and accepted the Working Families Party line, and part of the Working Families Party's platform is a call to defund the police. When you take a line, you're responsible for the baggage that comes with the line and the benefits. I reject the idea of defunding the police. I think that we need to make sure that we recognize that they have a difficult job. We need to support them as much as we can. I'm all for that. We need additional training, that's fine. But some of the fixes and reforms that are being proposed will certainly take resources away from putting actual law enforcement on our streets where they're needed. They'll be back doing paperwork, and they won't be keeping us safe.
Ms. Davis.
Yes, so Mr. Stec put on his Facebook page that I sought the Working Families Party endorsement knowing that they wanted to defund the police. He knows that that is not true. When you go for an endorsement for a party line, you have to do that before the ballots, before you have to go and do petitions, which is in January when I sought their endorsement. I don't believe that in defunding the police. I also don't think that Mr. Stec probably believes 100% in everything that the Republican Party does, nor do I with this issue with the Working Families Party.
Thank you. Mr. Stec, final word.
I've been endorsed by dozens of police agencies, the state troopers, the investigators, NYSCOPA, the PBA of New York State, Council 82, the corrections officers, 5 county sheriffs in the Senate district. I have a long track record of working with the police both at the local level and in the state assembly. The police know where I stand, and I think the police know where I know where they stand. They stand with me.
Ms. Davis?
Yes, thank you. I have communication as well. You don't hold the monopoly on that. I actually invited the chief of police here in the city of Plattsburgh to my house to talk about these issues. So it's not that because you are endorsed by unions who may have not given me the opportunity to even apply for those endorsements. I stand with our police departments with giving them the resources they need to succeed.
Candidates, thank you. And our next question now comes from Aaron Cerbone.
So despite the coronavirus pandemic this year, hiking in the high peaks this summer seems higher than ever. Concerns about overcrowding have been building for years. Should the state start issuing parking and hiking permits to ease overcrowding and overuse on the most popular trails?
I think we certainly need to look at the permitting system. It's a safety issue, both with parking and the trails themselves, with the number of people on them. There also needs to be education for people who are coming from out of the area and who may not be prepared to hike. The problem is that we have, in most areas, limited parking. We can't just increase parking. There is a huge cost to doing that, and in this year specifically, we don't have the money to do that. Certainly, state bureaucracy is not something I'm fond of, but a permitting system certainly is an easy solution for this problem, and we certainly need to also look at longer-term solutions, including educating people about the different trails that they can go on, and so everyone might think of their local favorite trail to go to, but we need to make sure that we are educating people on all of them.
Thank you. Mr. Stec, a minute 30.
Well, as many people know, but for those that don't, I'm an avid hiker. I mentioned in the beginning, my father is a retired forest ranger. I'm a 46er. I've done all the high peaks, most of them twice. I've done all the fire towers. I've done the Saranac Lake 6 summer and winter, the Lake Placid 9, the Lake George 12 summer and winter, the Tupper Lake Triad summer and winter. If you've got a mountain in your community, there's a really good chance that I've been on it. So I know firsthand the trails, their conditions, the parking issues. I know them well. There's no doubt that we need to address parking. That's a problem. My opponent just mentioned that it's expensive. Actually, I toured Mariah Shock just a couple weeks ago, and the superintendent there was very proud of the work that he and his crew had done, the inmates had done at Frontier Town, clearing the roads that's at very little cost to the taxpayers. This is manual labor. This is literally bulwark with crowbars to build trails. And then in a parking area is tree clearing and bringing in. We're not talking about paved parking lots. If you go look, a lot of these are crushed stone. So I don't think that cost should be the deciding or controlling factor. I think it's actually a minimal cost. I'm with the Commissioner Sagos on this. As the ranking member of the Assembly's Environmental Conservation Committee, I have regular contact with Commissioner Sagos on a variety of issues, and I've been that ranking member for 8 years. I've talked at length with him and his staff about the direction where we're going, and I think he and I are on the same page. We think that a permitting system, it's premature. There's other steps intermediate to that need to be executed and tried. First, increasing parking. One of them, increase technology so that people can see, oh, this trail is going to be crowded, this parking lot's going to be full, I'm going to go somewhere else. These are things that will spread the load so that we don't have everyone and their brother trying to climb Cascade on that gorgeous fall day. So I think that before we pull the trigger on moving forward with parking or with permits and fees, which are taxes, and the most highly taxed state in the country, that we focus on other solutions first.
Great, thank you. Next question, coming from Joe.
For years, from 1965 to 2002, Ron Stafford held the Senate seat in this district, Republican from Plattsburgh. Did very well, rose to the rank of chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, got a lot of funding, a lot of projects for this area, and is remembered as one of the great lawmakers in North Country history. Betty Little had this seat the last 18 years. A Republican, she was in the majority for most of the time. Also did very well for the North Country. Assemblyman, if you win, since the majority in the Senate has been flipped to the Democrats now, how effective of a legislator can you be in the minority?
That's a great question, and I've had the opportunity to prove that for 8 years as a member in the minority of the Assembly. And I can tell you this, that in the 8 years that I was in the Assembly, I passed more legislation through the Assembly and more legislation signed by the governor into law than any other Assembly Republican. Furthermore, the biggest thing that we do as legislators legislatively is constitutional amendments. They don't come around that often. I was at the table, key integral player in 4 constitutional amendments, 3 that are important to the Adirondacks, NICO Mineral, Township 40, and the Land and Safety Land Bank that most recently passed. But the 4th one was one that was of statewide importance, and that was pension forfeiture for corrupt officials. That was a bill of mine that I carried and that I brought to prominence and got attention both in the legislature, within the Capitol, but outside in the media, and then therefore with the public. And people like the idea that, you know, somebody that is convicted of corruption should not get a taxpayer-funded pension, but the Constitution prohibited judges from having the ability to pull that back. It required a constitutional amendment. That was my issue that I was able to meander through and get all the way eventually to the voters. And it passed overwhelmingly. So, you know, there's a lot that a member of the minority can do. The members of the minority are not beholden. We are independent voices. We can fix the bad work that sits there. I mean, a one-party system has not done the state well. It's not in our interest to have a one-party system. So, you know, if you do it well, like I think I have, you can be very effective in both getting your own work done, but also making sure that you're mitigating the damage of other bills.
Thank you. And Ms. Davis, obviously you would be part of the majority party. So, Joe, do we want to rephrase the question for Ms. Davis?
Yes. What advantages do you think you could get as part of the majority in serving this district?
So I think there's a reason that 9 Republican state senators chose not to run for re-election. Being in the minority is not fun, as some people have said, and even Betty in this last year and a half had to close her office in Plattsburgh. It's about resources and it's about a voice. In the past 2 years, Dan, you've introduced 36 bills and 12 of those passed. Senator Jennifer Metzger, who even though she was a freshman senator in that same 2-year period, introduced 147 bills and passed 44. In the 7 or 8 years of your time in the Assembly, you have passed 41, while in 2 years, she passed 44. So even though you might have the most, it isn't enough. We need to have somebody in the Democratic majority who has both a voice and a vote. There are enough votes democratically to get anything passed without Republican input. And I'm not saying that's the best system in the world, but there is a reason that we need a Democrat representing this area. There are only 3 Democrats representing rural areas in New York. It is incredibly important that I be in that room with a seat at the table, which Mr. Stec will not have, talking to my friends in the New York City and Long Island area and other places around New York who are Democrats, to tell them how something that they are proposing is affecting us differently in the North Country. It is incredibly important to have someone in the Democratic majority.
Next question coming from Aaron Cerbone.
Governor Cuomo has committed nearly $250 million in funding in just the past few years to help the Olympic Regional Development Authority upgrade its venues in Lake Placid. The goal is to ensure the region can continue to attract large-scale global events like the World University Games in 2023, while also transforming the facilities into year-round tourist attractions. Long range, as part of a statewide bid or an international bid with Quebec, would you like to see Lake Placid host another Winter Games?
It would be a great idea to have Lake Placid be the home of another Olympics. It is in the devil's in the details. I don't see the Olympic Committee allowing 2 countries to do it, but if you spread out the games, we have not only, of course, Whiteface, but we have other ski areas. We have Gore that we could, spread out and have Lake Placid as the anchor site for the Olympics. But the Olympic Committee does allow for activities to take part in various regions. We don't have the infrastructure for housing necessarily in Lake Placid, but Plattsburgh is certainly less than an hour away, and we have hotels here. There are hotels in Lake George. So we could really make this a regional bid, and I think it could be successful.
Thank you, Mr. Stec.
There are some difficult realities involved in attracting something like this, but the important thing is that if we don't keep up our infrastructure, if we make no attempt to keep up our infrastructure, we will have zero opportunity to host any games in the future. So it's very important that we know that as we make these decisions that we could easily close the door prematurely. So as a member of the minority, Senator Little and I have been successful in attracting this kind of level of investment, $250 million to ORDA and those venues. So I think that's been pretty effective on our part to work with the executive to make sure that he continues to support the opportunity of these venues. I'm open to anything, and I think that a regional approach and perhaps involving our Canadian neighbors is feasible. It would be very difficult, but nothing worthwhile is ever easy. So I'd be open to it. It certainly would be a boon, but we would have an awful lot of work to do. Among those things would be making sure that we can construct these resources in the Adirondacks, and there's some very real challenges to getting through administrative hurdles in order to build additional housing and build these venues out. But we've done it before, and I'd be willing to look at doing it again.
All right, our next question from Joe.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe New York is raising the minimum wage at the end of the year to $12.50 an hour in the North Country, on its way to $15 an hour over the next few years. I'm wondering if you support the phased-in increase in the minimum wage, or do you think it should be done like downstate in other parts of New York where it's happening a lot faster? And is $15 an hour eventually, is it enough these days?
Mr. Stec, let's begin with you.
Well, first of all, the minimum wage was never intended to be a living wage. And unfortunately, in my time in the legislature, there were other permutations of these bills that would have allowed for a training wage for younger worker. The minimum wage law as currently structured hurts our younger workers, which is one of the areas that it's intended or supposedly intended to benefit these younger introductory workers. The thing is that a one-size-fits-all approach is very commonplace in Albany to things in New York. And unfortunately, though, the labor markets are very differently. Long Island has a different labor market, a higher cost of living there, as does New York City and Westchester County. So $15 an hour there may not raise an eyebrow because that's where the market is already. But to say, well, we're going to be uniform throughout the state, $15 an hour here, the added cost to a lot of small businesses, I've been hearing from small businesses for my entire career about the cost of doing business in New York. NFIB has had it, the Business Council has had it, Unshackle Upstate has had it, that these are costs on our businesses that are chasing our businesses away from doing. Now, with that said, I'd rather have a phased-in approach than an all-at-once approach. So I think that if there's one area of the bill that was good, is that it didn't happen immediately, because I think that would have really been a significant immediate detriment to small business. But as we get there, eventually we are going to catch up, and the labor rates in New York City are going to be the same as they are here, although the labor market there is very different in New York City. The cost of living is very much higher than it is around here.
Thank you. Ms. Davis, a minute 30.
Yes, thank you. I do think that the regional approach taken with the minimum wage is a good idea. There are a lot of things actually that could be beneficial to the state if we did take a regional approach. I do agree that younger workers, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, these are people who have never worked, that our farmers and business people are teaching them for the first time how to work, and I do think that it is responsible for us to pass a wage that is lower for these first-time workers. So Dan certainly said that the minimum wage was not meant to be a living wage. Let's tell that to the companies that are paying minimum wage to people, regardless if they are 20 or if they are 40. We need to make sure that people have a living wage, that one person by themselves can support themselves. When I was a manager at a local bank, I had a teller who could not leave a bad relationship because she could not afford an apartment and a car on her own. That is inexcusable. We have to make sure that everyone earns a wage that they can survive comfortably on their own.
All right, next question, Aaron Cerbone.
This past session, the Assembly and the Senate passed a bill to study the damage of to waterways and wells polluted by the runoff of road salt in the Adirondack highways. Should the state make it more of a priority to find alternatives that allow the use of less salt in the Adirondacks? And should the state do more to assist and compensate homeowners who have contaminated water?
Ms. Davis, we're beginning with you.
Salt certainly is an issue. I was looking at buying a home a few years ago in an area that luckily the deal fell through, but it turned out a year later that the wells around the area, including the one I would have bought, were affected. And for years, those people did not have drinkable water. It is a serious issue, and we need to look at more environmentally sensitive ways to deal with this issue.
Mr. Stec.
Well, certainly my time in local government dealing with our waterways in Warren County when I was a local official there, specifically Lake George. And then now as a ranking member on the Environmental Conservation Committee in the Assembly, I've been working with a lot of groups on a lot of water quality issues. In fact, last fall, I co-chaired a task force on water quality where I traveled around the state and took testimony from various stakeholders from Long Island all the way to the Adirondacks and out into central New York. So this is an area that is important to me. I am a prime co-sponsor on the bill that you're talking about. Senator Little has this bill in the Senate, and Assemblyman Billy Jones and I have this bill in the Assembly. It's the Randy Preston salt bill. Randy Preston was passionate about this, and for those that may not know him, he was the town supervisor of Wilmington, the home of Whiteface, until he passed away recently. He was a dear friend of both mine and Billy's and Betty Little's. And he was very passionate about this issue. As a local official, you're always working with your highway department, trying to find ways to save money and to make sure that we're doing the best we can for the environment. The good news is that by and large, our highway departments have come around and they're willing and energetic about trying to find ways to protect the environment. That hasn't always been the mantra of highway departments, but in recent years, I think that just everyone's on the same page. So we're like, hey, if we can keep the roads safe, but find a way to have less salt going into our waterways, we're all for it. So they're on board. Now is the time with new technology, live edge on the plows, brine versus salt pellets. You know, these are the things that can put less salt on the roads and therefore into our things. The salt bill is a wonderful bill, and it's passed the Senate and the Assembly, and I hope the governor signs it tomorrow.
And now our final question from Joe LoTemplio.
As we know, prisons are a big aspect of the North Country life, and there's been talk in the last few years of the governor perhaps closing some more North Country prisons. Do you favor that? And if that happens, what can be done to help the communities that might lose a prison?
Mr. Stec, let's begin with you.
Thank you. Well, certainly I would oppose that, and my experience in the legislature working with both sides of the aisle, I think that the other side of the aisle wants to close prisons. They authorized in the budget last year great authority for the governor to close prisons on his own with very little notice. I voted against that, and that was also done as part of the budget. But I've toured the 3 prisons in Franklin County outside Malone. I've toured Clinton Correctional recently, and as I mentioned a couple questions ago, I was also recently at Mariah Shock. I try to visit the prisons to make sure that I'm conversant on what's going on there, and I'm proud to have the backing and support of NYSCOPA, the Corrections Officers Union, and Council 82, who's the leadership, some of the leadership positions are also there. So they know that I've been there, and they know that I've been listening to them and their needs. The closing, what we need to do is we need to end double bunking. That'll improve safety. So there's a way to do that. And as I mentioned earlier, though, with Mariah Shock right now isn't full. It can carry 300 people, and right now its current head count is around 74. When it's full, you've got a labor pool there. The program is designed for doing that. And as I said, they built the roads for Frontier Town near exit 29. This would be a wonderful source to, for them to give back, reduce their sentences, save the taxpayer a lot of money with Mariah Shock, and still get public works projects like High Peaks trails and parking lot work done. So I think it's way premature to say, let's let everyone out of jail and let's close these prisons. I am firmly opposed to closing our prisons.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. A minute 30.
Yes, thank you. I would have voted against this. I don't think anyone is just wanting to willy-nilly let prisoners go. I think that the law that passed that the governor has 90 days before he can close a prison is just not enough time. These are good jobs. These are places in our communities where unfortunately, in the past, when prisons have been closed, you can look at the Camp Gabriel's or you can look at Lion Mountain. These are facilities that are still vacant. Nothing has been done with them. The state has a responsibility to rehabilitate not only the facilities, but also the people who are losing their jobs because of any closures. So that, I think, would be something that I would try to put into law, is that if we're going to close a facility, the state has to plan what they're going to do with that facility, so it's not just an eyesore. Perhaps using Red Sea money to redevelop that into something that could be a good business, but also making sure that anyone who is losing their job is retrained. It is incredibly important that our communities that sometimes were built around these prisons don't fall by the wayside because the governor wants to shut these prisons.
Thank you very much. It's time for closing statements now. We're going to begin with Mr. Stec, a minute 30.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Tom, and Joe and Aaron and PBS here, Mountain Lakes PBS, for the opportunity to do this. I want to thank the voters for paying attention. It's been my great privilege to serve in the Assembly these last 8 years. All that experience, all the knowledge that I've accumulated at a local level for years, so much interaction between state government and local government occurs in the North Country. And having been a town supervisor and then an assemblyman for 8 years, I think has really prepared me. I think Senator Little agrees. Senator Little has endorsed me. I'm very proud of her endorsement. If there's one person on the planet that knows what it takes to represent this Senate district, it's Senator Betty Little. I'm delighted to have her full support and endorsement. One-party rule has simply been a disaster for New York State, and it's only going to get worse. Our spending appetite has only gotten worse. Our penchant for defunding the police and the direction that we're taking, I think most of us in the North Country, that is not indicative or reflective of our values as people in the North Country. As a member of the Senate, I will be an independent voice that can speak truth to power, to hit the brakes on some of the ridiculous stuff that's coming up from New York City into the Capitol and rolling itself out in the North Country. I've done that in the Assembly in a professional, polite manner. There's a time to challenge and push back, and of course there's a time to work together. And I've done that. The record shows that in my success with legislation, constitutional amendments, and delivering for my district. But we need somebody in there that's not going to just go with the flow and agree with whatever the New York City crowd wants to do. That's not been Betty's way, and that certainly won't be my way. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Davis, your closing statement.
Thanks very much, and thank you again to Mountain Lake PBS, Tom, and our journalists. I appreciate it. Being your state senator would be an honor and a privilege for me. My opponent has stated that for him, being state senator is the next logical step in his career. Public service is about service, not furthering one's political ambition. He recently stated the issues in New York don't change. I don't think any of us knew what coronavirus was last year or who George Floyd was. The only thing that is inevitable is change. Our duty as legislators is to improve the lives of our residents and keep them safe. Mr. Stec has voted against safety. He has voted against safe staffing measures in our hospitals, against preventing convicted domestic abusers to have guns, and against requiring police officers to file a report when they're discharging a weapon when a person can get struck by a bullet. Those are safety issues. Dan has voted to restrict your access to voting, for allowing COVID to be a reason to request an absentee ballot, and voting to make it harder to access early voting measures. I will go to Albany to fight for you, to have clean and water and air, better educational opportunities so you can live and work in your local community, for infrastructure, cell and broadband, for the rights of everyone to live to their full potential. I want to work for you in the New York State Senate, and I ask for your vote. Thank you.
Candidates, thank you very much. Thanks to our panel. Thanks to Susie Johnson, our timer with the League of Women Voters, and thank you, our viewers at home, for watching. Please vote on Election Day, November 3rd, if not before. Early voting begins this weekend on Saturday, October 24th in New York State and runs through Sunday, November 1st. You can find the hours for all of the days for early voting on your local County Board of Elections website. For all of us at Mountain Lake PBS, I'm Tom Halleck. Thanks for watching our Election 2020 special.